Hello and welcome to our webinar today, brought to you by our gold sponsor, NICE. Our session today is on demystifying ChatGPT for contact centre professionals. We are hearing so much about ChatGPT and its potential across multiple environments. However, with so much information out there, it can actually be really challenging to understand what are the important things to hear and what are the implications or use cases that are worth considering. Today is a real opportunity for you all to cut through that noise, for us to actually hear what ChatGPT can mean for the contact centre environment. In the spirit of reconciliation, Auscontact acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and during that time, with the help of today's guests, Belinda Haden and Ben Elliot, we hope this session provides interesting insights into what is happening in our current environment. To round off the session, as usual, we will have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the webinar. I'm Fran Southwood. I'm the CEO of Auscontact, and I'll be your moderator for today. You'll have to excuse my voice or lack thereof. I am getting over a bout of laryngitis, so hopefully you can still all hear and understand me. We'll run through just a little bit of housekeeping with you. Remember, we want you to interact with us to maximise the benefits that you take away. There's no need to take too many notes because, as always, we'll provide you with a recording of the webinar once it's completed. We want you to use the Q&A button on the control panel. You're all absolute experts at this by now. You can ask questions or you can make comments for Belinda and Ben. Now, where it makes sense, I'll ask them in real time, or alternatively, I'll keep them for the latter part of our session when we do have that full Q&A component. Make sure you type them as we go along though, because otherwise it's really easy to forget as you progress through the session. If you're listening through headphones or speakers and you experience any issues with your internet or your connection, please use the raise hand button on the panel and one of the team will actually come and rush to your aid and help you. Fantastic news. There's going to be a giveaway prize for the best question asked during the webinar session. The winner of that will actually take home one of the Jabra Evolve 2 75 headsets, which is fantastic. So thank you to Jabra and to NICE for organising that. Now there's going to be no challenge with who's the best question. We're going to get Belinda and Ben to actually be our judges for that today. So let's get those questions in and ensure that you stay through to the end of the webinar to be eligible for that. And then we'll announce our winners, our winner in the follow-up email following the webinar. So I'd like now to introduce our speakers for today. We have Belinda Haden, who is the Director, Strategic Alliances for APAC with NICE. And we also have Ben Elliot, Digital Solutions Consultant for NICE. Belinda, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you. Can't wait to hear the session today.
Thank you. Thank you, Fran. So our aim today is to demystify GPT in general and ChatGPT as an example, a branded version. So we'll start with the evolution of this pretty special technology, what it actually is, how we can use it, and some caveats and limitations of the technology. Then we'll have an open Q&A session, as Fran mentioned, where you can all ask complex questions of Ben, and if you can't answer them, then he can always ask ChatGPT. So I'm going to hand over to Ben to explain how we got to this point in the evolution of this AI journey. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Belinda. Cool. So I guess I went on a little bit of a deep dive, when we got the brief for this this session, because some of the things, some of the history I knew, and other bits I was a little bit unclear about, and I guess I wanted to share that background, I guess, with you as a way to kick off today's session. So I guess from, I guess, what I was looking at, there was kind of four main milestones in the history of AI and I guess machine learning and I guess computing in general. The first of which was Alan Turing, obviously famously created the Turing machine to crack the German Enigma machine. But I think second most famously is known for the Turing test. And so the Turing test was first introduced to the public in 1950 in his Machinery and Intelligence paper. Shortly following that, John McCarthy, kind of known as one of the founding fathers of AI alongside Alan Turing and another two who I wasn't familiar with. I actually, unfortunately, didn't take their names down. But he's known for coining the term AI. And basically, he defined it as the construction of computer programs to engage in tasks that are, currently or more satisfactorily performed by human beings. So basically saying that, tasks that require high level mental processes, right? So perceptual learning, memory organization, critical reasoning. And so in 1956, he formed the first, research organization at MIT to begin to study artificial intelligence. And then after a good 41-year gap, the next big cultural milestone is IBM's Deep Blue beating Garry Kasparov at chess. So Garry Kasparov obviously being the world champion at the time. In fact, I think he was beaten in 97. The score was 3-2 with a stalemate. But Kasparov actually managed to beat Deep Blue the year before. So it was actually a rematch that he originally beat, or first beat Deep Blue. And then I guess the next big thing, there's lots of little things that happen throughout, I guess, the evolution of AI. But I think the next big splash culturally was actually the release of Siri. Siri was actually originally released as a standalone app in iOS. And they had plans to expand to Android and BlackBerry and stuff. But it was so successful that within 2 months of its release, Apple acquired it and obviously made it their own and kind of brought it into iOS wholesale. So you'll notice here, there's a kind of a few periods where things kind of happen quite quickly, and then some big breaks. 41 years from the first setup of a research organization, and then also another good 14 years between the chess win versus Siri. And so in the industry, this is referred to as the AI winter. And so this is essentially just a reflection of kind of hype cycles. People get really excited about things. There's a lot of investment, and then things don't really pan out as well as they could have or should have or were expected to. And so, research and funding dries up and things kind of go quiet for a little while. The troopers, they soldier on, they continue research and things pick up again, the hype increases and research comes back. But I thought that was just a really interesting piece of backstory to help paint the picture of why things kind of move in cycles, I guess. So I guess a little bit of background of OpenAI. So OpenAI are obviously the company responsible for ChatGPT. They're actually originally founded in 2015. They were originally supposed to be just a research lab, and they were going to work with patents and publish their patents and research open to the public. So it would be kind of a team effort, in terms of the research into AI. In 2017, Google released what's known as the Transformer paper. So this is basically the framework. It laid the groundwork for the transformer process. It's quite heavily utilized in GPT, and we'll hear a little bit more about what that means in a moment. In 2019, OpenAI actually transitioned to a for-profit model. When I first saw this, I thought, they realized they've got a winner on their hands, so they're going to go make some money for it. But when I read a little bit deeper, it's actually they went to a capped for-profit model, and the idea was actually so that they could attract better talent because they weren't able to pay the Facebooks, the Apples, Amazon, Netflix, Google data engineers enough to bring them away from those high-paying, database jobs. So they went for-profit so that they could provide stock options to their potential recruits. Shortly after, GPT-2 was released. This didn't go viral primarily because it wasn't immediately released. They were concerned that there was potential misuse. This was at a time when fake news was all the rage, and they were really worried about GPT contributing to that problem. Again, shortly after that, June 2020, GPT-3 was released. So similar problem, GPT-3, the fully trained model wasn't immediately released to the public. They were worried about possible misuse. And shortly after that, they licensed exclusively to Microsoft. Now, after Microsoft's success, November 2022, as we all know, ChatGPT goes viral. It reached like 1 million users in just 5 days, which I think we've got a diagram on this, but it's like one of the fastest tech startups to achieve such market penetration so quickly. And then more recently, OpenAI released GPT-4, which kind of comes on the heels of the ChatGPT going so viral, and just offers like a number of improvements, able to accept text as well as image, can read and write code in all major languages. I think the major marketing material that came with that was that GPT-4 could pass the bar in the top 10% of test takers, which is pretty impressive if true. So with that in mind, so just a little bit of a tangent before we kind of get into the weeds. I'm a bit of a YouTube watcher in my spare time, and I watch this particular YouTuber, Tom Scott. So he does a number of like educational videos. He focuses on like weird cultural things or infrastructure or code basics, that sort of thing. So I encourage you to have a look if you haven't come across this guy, because he's got a years-long backlog of fantastic videos. But more recently, he came out with a video titled "Everything is About to Change," and this was focused on ChatGPT and I guess the cultural impacts of GPT overall. And he presented an idea that really resonated with me, which was the idea of technology growth. And he related ChatGPT back to a historical one that we could kind of look to for inspiration and draw some parallels. So he presented this idea that technology growth and adoption generally follows what we call a sigmoid curve, right? And so we have a really slow takeoff. People like the idea, but they take the time to do the research, build the tools. And then, over time, we reach this inflection point where, potentially something goes viral or something is particularly useful, and it begins to pervade the, cultural consciousness, the masses get their hands on it. And then obviously that growth increases over time. Tools are built, and tools are built on top of those tools, and we explore the possible applications for that technology. And then we reach kind of a plateau where we've kind of explored all of the possible options for this particular technology. And of course, in retrospect, it's really easy to look at that and see, well, where were we at one particular point in time? But it's really hard when you're in the thick of it to know, are we at a local minimum or a local maximum, or are we right in the middle of explosive growth? So the comparison that he drew was actually with file sharing and I guess digital streaming and media, right? And so he looked at Napster being kind of the first big cultural moment where the masses got their hands on a tool to move away and disrupt existing businesses, the record industry and physical media distribution. And things exploded. There were many different variations of Napster after it was shut down, ultimately leading to the benefits and the conveniences that we enjoy today of your Spotify's and your Apple Musics and whatnot. And we don't see a whole lot of growth or change in that landscape today. And so he also then drew the comparison to ChatGPT. So, but with the massive question, like, where are we on this curve? Are we at the point where ChatGPT is that inflection point and we're about to see a huge amount of growth and change and innovation within the market? Or are we at like a local maximum somewhere along this curve where, thank you for linking that video, where, we're exploring, the different levels of capability. So I think there's an argument to be made for both sides of that coin. The fact, again, like we mentioned, that ChatGPT was capable of reaching 1 million subscribers in just 5 days is probably a huge indication that we're at the bottom of that technology growth curve. So yeah, really exciting to see what ways that ChatGPT generally is increased, but also how we as a as a collective, become more familiar with GPT and the technology space, and find different ways to use it and build upon it. So we went and had a look at Gartner to kind of give us an idea of what the analysts are saying about GPT. And so here are just a couple of stats on where they see things going. And I think for the most part, we'd all agree that these are kind of, I guess, a bit of common sense. I think it goes without saying that ChatGPT will change rapidly over the coming years. I mean, it's already changed in the last couple of months in terms of the release of GPT-4, the release of their plugins capability. So I think that the applications will just, again, grow exponentially. There's no doubt going to be a number of competitors. We've already seen a number, the Bing example of search. I think that might actually be a ChatGPT implementation, but also Google kind of entering the market with Bard, currently available in the US and the UK. And then another one, which I think a little bit hard to quantify, maybe. I think it probably in this context, they're referring to users, employees interacting with robo colleagues in the sense that they might be chatting with them directly, maybe a really direct ChatGPT comparison. But I guess there's the argument to be made that tools, more traditional AI tools like RPA or conversational AI might contribute to that number as well. So remains to be seen, but really exciting numbers nonetheless. So with that, I will hand back to Belinda to give us a little bit of a deep dive on her exploration of ChatGPT and its workings.
Thank you, Ben. So taking a little bit of a step back in terms of ChatGPT, what is it? So moving to the next slide, basically in the manner of pretty much all articles that I've read on the topic, which did exactly the same thing, I decided to compare man versus machine, or in this case, woman versus machine. And on the right, I asked GPT to articulate what GPT is, suitable for a business audience. And that's one of the cool things about GPT is you can specify the audience type or, the style of output or whatever. You can see, when explained to a 6-year-old or a business audience or, a colleague or a friend or whatever. And it's pretty good. It tells you what it stands for and pretty much what it does. And then on the left, I created a definition according to how I generally would go about it. What, in terms of what is GPT, and then specifically what is ChatGPT, and what do those acronyms G and P and T stand for. And so that meant, defining GPT, which is basically a generative model. In other words, it generates sort of an outcome based on pre-trained data, which is basically all of the kind of language model, which is capable of producing an output or response based on a user's natural language prompt. So in other words, you can type in however you want to type in your own language. You don't have to sort of have the special secret question or put it into narrow confines according to how an engine will understand it. So when we say the response is generative, what we mean is that it's composed of the most likely generated computed response based on the pre-trained data. And that's important because it means that the answer might not already be in there. It's going and finding, according to all the stuff that is in there, what's the likely answer for what you're specifically asking. So GPT is a kind of a generic term. And the G stands for generative. In other words, it's generating the responses based on patterns and structures. So that's the kind of dynamics of language. And there's two elements to that. It's the language it's using based on the large language model, and there's the content it's using, which in ChatGPT is basically the internet material that it's soaked up. Pre-trained is basically the large corpus of data that it's used to fine-tune for a specific task. So that can be, the linguistic patterns, the structures, the inferences which it can take. And we can also use a different model for the content of the response. So there's the way it interacts, and then there's the content of its interaction. And then transformer, which basically, I can never use that word without sort of thinking robots in disguise, but I think that probably says more about my particular sort of age or gen or whatever than anything else. But essentially it's based on a type of neural network architecture called a transformer. And essentially what the transformers do is they transform your request into robot speak, and then go and fetch the answer, and then they transform their answer that they're going to create into human speak. So that's the kind of transformative element of it. So we've got generically what GPT is, and specifically ChatGPT is the kind of the brand version of the tool that Ben talked about, launched by OpenAI in November 2022. And that's the one really that everyone kind of has been using and playing with, but there are a few others. And those of us who have played with it are pretty familiar with kind of what it can do. Usually you sort of put in text and stuff like that, but there's quite a few things that you can ask it to do and ask it for answers of as well. Okay, so essentially, you know, you've got these sort of two different definitions of them. I tried to make mine a bit more slidey, which of course ChatGPT doesn't do right now, but there are different models of generic GPT where you can create PowerPoint slides, such as Otter, Beautiful AI. I tried those also, but they weren't great at the content. In other words, defining ChatGPT. Or, for example, brand formatting, so they wouldn't do it like on, you know, nice template slides. So my impression was that this was kind of easiest done by hand at the moment, which was a bit of a relief. So it means that I still have a job for now. So moving onwards to what's actually going on under the bonnet during a ChatGPT conversation. So essentially it's this process here. So when we talked about those transformers, that involves this. A user inputs the prompt. So you're basically just typing in whatever words you want to use. You know, please word an introduction for an audience of whatever. And then the system will transform your input into kind of computer robot speak. And then it generates a hidden representation of what you've put in. So it captures that text, the content, the meaning. So in a very similar way to intent classification does in a traditional intelligent virtual assistant. And then it decodes that, which basically means provide the answer, but still in sort of robot speak, if you like. And it sort of looks at all the information that it has available to it from a content perspective and says, okay, this is probably a good answer or the good answer. And this is, based on what the user probably meant. And then it crafts that response using the sort of the language element of the system, and then presents the output to the user. And usually you can generate an alternative response, sort of asking it, can you try again or be more specific? Or you can also progress and clarify your request by contextual conversation. So, for example, you could say, okay, but could you explain what you mean by such and such? And it can refer backwards to the conversation, which is what we mean by contextual. So it's really much more like having a conversation with, a human being that can refer back to 2 or 3 lines ago versus, a goldfish that kind of has forgotten what we said 2 sentences ago. Okay. So it's a great data model already, and it's capable of quite a lot at the moment. So one of the main capabilities of it is, as we've already said, it's generative. So it doesn't need predetermined questions or answers or intent classification for us to kind of think about, what kind of questions could be asked. And it builds responses based on this massive corpus of pre-trained data and this adaptive large language model. So that means it's pretty much seen it all in terms of how we construct sentences, grammar, phraseology, etc. It's very human-like because of that. So adopts natural language processing generation. And And it also allows you to click through a bit like Ben should be doing now. Thank you, Ben. Thank you. So it's very easy to interact with as a user without any training or coding experience. I have no technical under the bonnet coding expertise, and I find it incredibly easy to use. On top of that, it's highly accurate based on the deep neural network design and again, that very large training corpus. And it does have that full contextual awareness that we've spoken of. You know, it can refer back to a couple of sentences ago as well. Additionally, it will give you that 24/7 accessibility. So, you know, again, not like a human that you've got to decide when they're on, when they're off. It has the multilingual capacity. It can read and produce text in multiple languages and also can translate with very high accuracy. And also it has the capability for personalization via these APIs that we're going to cover in a little bit, to offer individualized recommendations and replies. So at the moment, you know, we may need a little bit of caution over the content inside something like ChatGPT, but you can personalize the actual content and, you know, just keep the linguistic capabilities of it. So in terms of limitations, at the moment, ChatGPT specifically, ChatGPT specifically is generic. It has a huge database under it, but it's not tuned to individual organizations or product portfolios or desired outputs unless its capabilities are used in conjunction with specific content models. So for example, if you ask it, you know, about a specific, you know, how do I go about using this particular product or whatever, it's not going to know that, you know, you want to take it to a knowledge base of a particular product, for example. Inherently, the biggest issue that people have spoken about at the moment is bias. So it is based on what was in the internet to start with. So it is liable to learn and reflect social biases contained in the training data. Now, there's a certain amount of manual identification and computational elimination you can do, but you've got to find it first, be aware of it, and then try to computationally reprogram that. So that's kind of a, you know, a task in itself. There are some limitations in its complex reasoning. Quite often that's going to be based on how the user asks the request. And, you know, if you've tried it yourself, you may have found that you might ask the question a couple of times in different ways, or then clarify a style or whatever. And at the moment, GPT, ChatGPT and most of the others do tend to have unimodal responses. So although we do expect that to come fairly soon. So what we mean by that is that you don't currently have the ability to say, for example, can you produce me a PowerPoint slide on the definition of ChatGPT suitable for a business audience and use this as a template? So I could either have the text or I could produce a slide, but not necessarily, you know, both. It fundamentally lacks empathy, so it can't actually comprehend thoughts, sentiments, and potentially it could come out with inappropriate responses, of course. Although I noticed that, you know, it's been trained very specifically to kind of say, you know, I am just an AI, so I'm not able to, you know, give opinions, blah, blah, blah. And something that I think is interesting is that ultimately the large language model data is finite. So the actual way that it interacts with you, that kind of human-like backwards and forwards, is nearly as good as it's going to get linguistically. So we talk about, you know, data being the new oil, but like oil, it is finite. The most effective way traditionally to build more powerful large language models is to train them on more data. But the world's total stock of high quality text data is between 4.6 trillion and 17.2 trillion tokens. And GPT-4 already used 300 billion tokens. Now, here's an example of how I actually have used GPT, because I don't know what the difference between a billion and a trillion is. I asked GPT to divide 300 billion by 4.6 and 17.2 trillion. So effectively, we've used roughly 6.5% of the potential world's high quality text data already. So there's a limit to sort of how much more we can throw at it in order to improve its capabilities there, which I find quite interesting. So moving on, this is not necessarily—
Belinda, I was just going to say, can we go back to that last slide? And Ian's got a really good question in the Q&A, just in relation to the accuracy. So, when we say highly accurate, what do we mean? Is it 60, 75%, 99%?
Really
sort of
good
accuracy we're talking?
Actually, and I think that there's two measurements there. I think it's it doesn't really help that actually accurate is not accurate itself, is it? It's actually slightly mistyped there. So there's two elements to the accuracy. The accuracy in terms of how it understands your question and responds, I think is incredible. The quality is really, really strong. The accuracy in terms of the content of what it's going to produce, that is less certain. One of the things that we know is that the data in the GPT 3.5 and 4 was only trained on information up to 2021. So if you ask it, information after that, about, I don't know, like buildings or companies or whatever, that may have massively shifted sort of since the pandemic, it won't know. And it can make errors. And on top of that, it could potentially make some errors anyway. And it can do so, it can do what we call hallucinating, which is to give you a confident answer, but actually be quite incorrect. So I like to separate it in terms of the content and the style. And I think very accurate in terms of its style and its ability to understand what you're asking. But in terms of spitting out the correct answer, you have to, you would probably want to double check if, if it was important.
And that probably leads on, Samantha's kind of taken that next step forward in her question around, knowing where that data comes from and not using data that's not correct. It's one of the challenges we're seeing.
Definitely. And that's what we're going to look at in a little while. We're going to look at how you can combine the best of that, which I think is the interactivity of it, with the content that you might be a bit more certain of.
I just in this instant I had a quick look because I wasn't 100% certain, but yeah, essentially the data sources for GPT 3 and 4 are Wikipedia, online corpuses of books, as well as website data that's been crawled over the course of 8 years and validated. So it's not going to be 100% accurate. Sure, like there's going to be errors here and there, but the point of the deep neural net is that those inaccuracies self-correct.
Thanks, Ben. So moving on to the kind of different types of AI and so GPT in itself and ChatGPT is not necessarily the first horse out the gate in terms of AI. We've had chatbots, aka intelligent virtual assistants. So how is this different?
Sure. Yeah. So look, they all come from the same genus, right? They're all based on very similar concepts in the sense that they're built on neural networks and and large data sets. I think the historical ones, that maybe, I mean, in the context of contact center, the enterprise conversational AI probably makes the most sense to talk about. There's plenty of other examples out there. Generally, are designed to be business tools, right? They move towards a business outcome, and so I guess the way that I've rationalized this in my mental model is that the historical ones are the old ones, so to speak, cast a wide net to lead the customer to a narrow outcome, and that's the business outcome. It's reset a password or send an email or whatever you're automating within the context of the contact center. Whereas GPT is more, it casts a wide net, but it also has a very wide array of possible outcomes. So I've tried to visualize this in this slide, which is hopefully makes sense with that description. With the enterprise solutions, we go out, we set out to think of all of the different ways that a customer might say a particular intent or or outcome that they want to achieve. And also generally with those enterprise solutions, they don't come out of the box with models that achieve that unless they're sold off the shelf with, here's 100 different variations that we've seen customers ask this particular question, this common inquiry. And generally, like I said, it funnels them down a path where we've automated a business process where we need pieces of information from you. We ask various questions so that we can lead you to an outcome and hopefully avoid the call to the contact center. Whereas, GPT, on the other hand, whether it's using the public data sets or whether it's using a private data set to answer queries, at least at this point, and maybe a little bit more on how that might change in the future in a sec. But at this point, it's really designed to provide answers and answer queries and do that based on the data set that it's been given, and not necessarily, execute business outcomes. So, like I said, we've got a little bit more on what that means in future in a sec. But yeah, like this is my understanding of what that comparison looks like. Which leads me to this slide, which is basically just doing a side-by-side comparison of some of the high-level points, maybe just in a little bit more detail instead of my hastily drawn mental model. So hopefully, I don't want to just read these out, but hopefully this kind of helps to codify, I guess, what I was just talking about, in the sense that, from a GPT point of view, things tend to be unstructured, and also the output is also somewhat unstructured. It doesn't necessarily lead to a business outcome. Whereas on the conversational AI side, we want to provide like those unidimensional answers. We want to conform that response to the business brand image. We don't want it to necessarily be something that the model says should be accurate. We want to make sure that it aligns with the way that we want to communicate with our customers. And so that's kind of at this point, the way that we delineate them until we build the trust in the GPT model that it's actually able to represent our brand appropriately. We'll probably err on the side of caution and use these enterprise conversational AI solutions. As Belinda said, GPT generates as opposed to conversational AI. We tend to use things that are pre-written, which again comes back to that ability to kind of cultivate our brand image instead of relying on something to do it for us. And I think the theme here is that it's about trust. We don't know enough about GPT. We don't know how well it conforms to our standards. It is very impressive, but a lot of the use cases that have been implemented publicly tend to be public with an asterisk. It's you have to sign up. It's a closed beta. They make sure that the limitations and that that things don't necessarily represent their opinions and thoughts as a brand and that sort of thing. One example I came across when I was running through the research for this presentation was Stripe. So if anyone's used ChatGPT, you'll know that they're now selling a premium model, and that was the outcome of a partnership with Stripe. And so basically, Stripe put payments on ChatGPT, and ChatGPT went and trained a private model on Stripe's developer documentation. So they've now provided a GPT developer experience for Stripe. And when I tried to sign up for that, I had to go through like a 3-page application process, and it needed to go off and send off and come back and get approval and all that sort of thing. So the marketing material was very impressive. It looked very cool to use, but when I tried to use it, it was incredibly difficult to actually get there and use it as a customer. So and then the last, again, is control. It's fine-tune. It's being able to fine-tune things. And with GPT, there are some capabilities to fine-tune an existing model. You can do the same level of training where you provide mappings. When the customer says this, we want this to happen. But you still cede quite a bit of control to the model in terms of the generative side of things. So,
yeah. Next question that I have, and here's a sentence that I never thought I'd say, is could we talk technical for a moment? And I think there's maybe two sides to GPT, there's talking to GPT when you're sort of, typing in your questions, and then there's GPT talking to and reaching out to the internet or applications within companies to, execute the commands, etc. So I read a lot as well about, APIs and stuff. What do we mean by that? Plugins. So all the kind of integrations and things, I guess, that we read about that we can do with GPT. What does all that mean?
Sure. So I guess we've kind of looked at, we've discussed briefly the possibility of building a private model. And so that's essentially building up a GPT model, but based on your internal data. And so a lot of brands are approaching that as a way to kind of bring GPT capability into their enterprise stack. I mean, it's certainly one of the approaches that we've taken. But from a ChatGPT point of view, more specifically, like you said, there's ways to talk to ChatGPT, and there's ways that ChatGPT can talk to external systems. Since its release, ChatGPT has been available via API, so we can, you don't necessarily have to go on to ChatGPT and type in your queries. You could potentially surface that as as an assistant, or as an additional time-saving tool, maybe to your agents or something like that. Very, very simple, but it's essentially just changing the user interface. It's integrating ChatGPT's capability into something else. The flip side of that is plugins, which were released recently. They're in a closed beta at the moment. But plugins essentially address the problem, in inverted commas, that GPT is trained up until a point. So there's a cutoff date where the data stops. They decided this is the date that we stop adding more data. I think it's 2021, September 2021, or something like that. And so if you ask GPT without the plugin capability questions about current events, what's going on right now, what are stock prices, what's the weather, it can't answer you because it doesn't have that information as part of its model. You can ask.
It's not as if much happened over the last couple of years, is it?
No, exactly right. You can ask it about history, and it will have access to that context, and that's fine. So plugins is essentially a way to use the tokenization within that model that Belinda was talking through, the phased process, to identify potential external sources to gather information. And so GPT have approached this problem by kind of bringing in specific plugins. So they've done things like integrating external solutions like Expedia, Instacart, which is like a grocery ordering platform, Kayak, which you might have used for like flights and cars and stays, bookings, OpenTable, which is familiar for booking tables. So the idea of this capability is to say, enable use cases where you can reach out to external systems and either gather information to present as an answer, or even execute actions in those systems. So you might say, ChatGPT, can you recommend me 5 restaurants for my anniversary, this weekend? And it might come back and say, oh, what kind of, well, I probably will give you 5, but then you can refine your query and say, well, actually, I want it to be romantic, and so it might come back with a refined 5. And then you could ask it, well, can you please book me to that fancy one, number 3? And it might be able to reach out to OpenTable and actually secure the booking for you. So instead of just kind of working in isolation and being in this walled garden, it can actually kind of reach through the fence and say, perform this action or gather this piece of information. So really, really cool capability. And as that plugin functionality expands, we'll see more and more very interesting use cases.
Cool. And so that actually kind of takes us seamlessly onto the next questions, really, which is, what are the potential applications of ChatGPT? I think I've used it for sort of the general obvious stuff like, define this for me and stuff like that. And also for calculations, occasionally, like I said, what's this billion divided by trillion, because I didn't know how many zeros were in either. I've also occasionally used it to, articulate what I want an Excel formula to do, and asked it to, and told it what cells it was in. And it's come back with a really perfect formula for me. So I was pretty happy with that. But there are multiple potential functions for it. So could you take us through some of those?
Yeah, I think that's kind of been half the fun of the virality of ChatGPT, is everyone sharing their crazy and cool things that they've done and going, oh, I never thought I could do that, and just expanding the collective consciousness of like what it is that you can potentially do. I guess a few examples, I had a friend that decided that he would avoid having to read self-help books by asking GPT to summarize the pertinent points of those self-help books. So, text summarization, really powerful. It's able to kind of take the key points, the repeated points, the things in bold, or the things that have lots of connections textually to other elements of the book, and spit out something that makes sense from a summarization point of view. I know from a code debug, I know you just mentioned Excel, but from a code debugging point of view, I work a little bit more on the technical side, and with our conversational AI platform product, there's a lower level where you can go in and write code, right? And it was in a language that I'd never worked with before. And I was able to just type out in dot points what I wanted it to do. And it came back, it gave me a function that seemed like it would work, and I pasted it in, and it kind of worked maybe 75% of the way that I wanted it to. And so I could just go back to GPT and say, well, this bit doesn't work. And it goes, okay, well, how would you like me to do it? You can do things iteratively and over time. So really interesting use cases in terms of like the ability to give you a prompt, get you started, do that first 75% of something before you move on to the actual nuts and bolts. So I think that's probably my takeaway here, is that, and especially in the discussion of the next few slides, is that GPT, it's at this point, maybe in the future it will become something way more than it is. And again, coming back to that sigmoid curve, maybe it gets better and it gets more trust and we can rely on it and there's more transparency and all that sort of thing. But for now, it's a tool to do the legwork. You kind of still need that domain expertise to say what it's spit out is accurate and correct, and I can validate that, and and it's useful. But if I use it out of domain, if I ask it to, I don't know, correct my grammar or my spelling, maybe I'm not the best speller, and if I trust it to do that for me, there's risk for me because I don't have the knowledge and the capability to validate that output myself. So that's really the takeaway for me.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is quite good at the text generation. Like if you sort of say, this is kind of what I'm trying to say in plain English, could you kind of, business it up a bit for me or turn it into, it tends to be quite good at that. I'd be interested maybe in the Q&A section to sort of have some more examples of how other people have used it as well. And I think moving to specifically how we can use GPT or ChatGPT in the contact center, how can we adapt it to this space?
Yeah, so I think, again, this comes back to I guess a lot of what we've discussed already is imagining and sharing the ways that we've used it creatively as a community, I guess. And so what we're presenting here is our putting our heads together here and thinking about a couple of possible ways to utilize it, but by no means exhaustive, and I'm sure it's not going to be the best examples of how it could be used in the future. But yeah, so like using it to kind of automate various actions within the contact center, I think the obvious one is to put it in place of the existing conversational AI solutions. But as we kind of already discussed, I think there's a big difference between levels of capability and trust between those two solutions. So maybe as a proof of concept, or maybe just as a bit of a toy, it could be utilized from customer-facing applications. But again, coming back to that idea of being able to have the domain knowledge to validate what it's outputting. I think it's going to find a place in front of agents as an assistance tool instead of maybe direct customer capability. And yeah, maybe like sidecar capability, agent assist kind of thing, take what the consumer has said and suggest generative answers based on trained business data. We've got our knowledge base as a potential source, and it's providing contextual but real-time answers as the conversation's going on. And obviously there's tools for that kind of thing already, but maybe a quicker time to market, perhaps, if those integrations eventuate. So how can contact centers start using AI solutions? I think everyone's scrambling, right? Everyone's scrambling to get something out in front of customers, in front of brands, so it can be utilized and we can test it and we can learn. But yeah, I think there's we've got a couple of slides coming up that might help to show how we're hoping to utilize it. But yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to, do you have a good use case, and is it something that you can get past some of the risks and trust issues to utilize in the short term, or is it the kind of thing that you kind of wait and see how it progresses and see how other people are using it, and maybe don't necessarily be on the bleeding edge, but learn from some of those initial attempts and potential failures.
Yeah, and I think sort of some of those companies that are just using it exactly how it is now without kind of changing the content model, they are quite sort of public companies, aren't they? Sort of more your holiday companies where the information might be generic anyway, like where should I go on holiday, that type of stuff. It's it's quite harmless, the content.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
So then when I know that NICE say that we are GPT integratable. And so I was looking at what does that mean? And then I came across our product, basically, which was Enlighten Actions. And what that meant for us was that we've built capabilities using the GPT capabilities, which is the natural language dialogue flow and the generative outcomes, but with our insight capabilities. So the content is based on, the NICE products, whether that's from, sort of the speech analytics, text analytics, or the WFM information, or whatever it is. So, for example, you can then use like natural language to say, what are the top 5 opportunities for automation, and it will tell you that. And then, you could then come back and say, well, how much would that be worth? And, you can have that kind of interactive dialogue with it. And you can also ask it to say, well, can you produce me a report on that? Could you turn that into a knowledge article, for example? So I found that kind of surprisingly simple to understand what we've done there. And I think that's where I was able to understand it the most easily, was to separate it, as I said, into the format of GPT, which is that dialogue, natural dialogue, on the content of where it's getting the information from, which in this case is not the internet, the Wikipedia and the kind of generic stuff. And so, another example of what you might kind of be able to do in that dialogue, using natural language, you can, if you go to the next slide, you could just sort of say, okay, here's the information that you were asking for. What are the top 5 call types that we don't have knowledge articles for? And it would tell you, again, from like, maybe speech text analytics, from the content of the conversations. And you can say, okay, great. Now can you write me knowledge articles for each of those? And it will, use a combination of that large language model and the information, inherent in your conversations, which obviously is a lot of data as well. And then, even further from that, we can interrogate the data and write corrective plans even. So, if you move forward just to the last one, what we could do with it is even just like in the CX1 product would say, you know, what interactions have the lowest satisfaction, and it will, I deliberately kind of cut and pasted this on the generating content slide, and it will like, yeah, okay, let me have a look at that, and it will produce it, you know, in the formats that we use inside the product, which is reports and graphs and stuff like that, as opposed to, you know, like the text that it would generate if we were going maybe and using it in native into the system. So we could interrogate the data and write corrective plans, for example. And so in terms of what you've just spoken about, Ben, the kind of like the at a geek level, because that's more where you sit than where I sit. What's the technology doing or using in this sort of scenario in terms of NICE versus GPT? You know, where you talked about the APIs, the plugins. What is it? Is it using more of a plugin there?
So I think in this particular instance within Nexo and Actions, it's probably a GPT model trained on Enlighten data. So it's basically looking at the insights that have been extracted from customer conversations, and it's using that as the corpus of knowledge. So it's probably not even looking at utilizing plugins, because that would probably more of a ChatGPT kind of capability. It would be using that tokenization to basically say what are some of the improvements we can make. You know, what are the key intents. It's using that as the corpus of data to provide those generated responses. So yeah, I mean, in a similar vein, we've got proof of concepts that use our knowledge-based solution as the corpus of data. So you can basically have generative, you know, FAQs or, you know, information that's kind of presented from a really internal source of information, and really contextual without all of the worries of, you know, data privacy and leaking by using ChatGPT. Okay. Which brings us nicely to the next slide.
It does. So yeah, you know, everything's fabulous. I guess the big question is, what could possibly go wrong, Ben?
Yes, well, I'll get ahead of one of the questions I've seen that's just been asked there, which is data privacy. So yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. There are real concerns about data privacy using ChatGPT. I think there was an example in the media not too recently about how it was a technology vendor. They had developers using ChatGPT to write code and review code and stuff, and they had proprietary data leaked to external sources via ChatGPT. So it is actually feeding back what it's learning. It is utilizing what users are putting into ChatGPT. And so they just used it enough that it became part of the model, and it was something that was exposed. So it is a real concern. ChatGPT don't provide any privacy assurances. And so if your organization's anything like NICE, there's been, you know, announcements saying do not put proprietary data, don't put anything private, you know, customer information, just don't do it. You know, we just don't know enough about how those models work in terms of the feedback to be able to, you know, provide any assurances. So that is a real concern, and it's the reason why I think the virality of ChatGPT will lead to a lot more attention on GPT more generally. I don't think ChatGPT will be the business way forward. I don't think it will be the enterprise path forward, but it is forging the way in terms of mindshare. The next is like accuracy and trustworthiness. I think we kind of covered this already in the difference between GPT style solutions versus conversational AI. Yeah, there's no real way to be 100% certain about how it reached an answer, or sway it towards providing particular answers based on what the business would like it to say. So it's very difficult to have that as an assurance, as not be a risk as part of a deployment using ChatGPT. And Belinda, of course, has already covered data bias. It's trained on publicly accessible data, and of course that publicly accessible data reflects real human bias. So yeah, I think it's a real concern in terms of how we approach that. I think there's been a lot of discussion around how we make sure that bias doesn't enter into the consciousness of AI. But I don't think it's something that we have a real answer to at this point. AI is essentially a mirror to our cultural biases. And then lastly is malicious misuse. And so I think this kind of feeds back into, there's numerous public examples of self-learning chatbots that were trained by malicious actors to answer questions in extremely negative and racist ways and that sort of thing. And so there's obviously quite valid concerns that same problem could surface within ChatGPT. So again, it comes back to that trustworthiness of content accuracy. Like if we're relying on the human inputs to reach a generated response, then we have to trust those human inputs, and we can't. So that's a real problem. So we're obviously reaching time, so I'm not sure if we've got time for Q&A, but I'll hand back to Fran to give me that answer.
Thanks, Ben. There's a couple of really good questions, and I think some of the risks you've just brought off really actually address some of those. And for those that have questions in the Q&A, we are at time, so we will actually include those in what we send out. I'm going to leave you with one, Ben, because I think it's a great question. With natural reluctance to see that new technology tried and tested, what are some ideas or recommendations to help people listening encourage or build the appetite within their organisation to explore this utilisation, given all of those risk components that you covered? How is it that people can actually challenge effectively? Is it that they need to, sort of partner with others, but how do they get in there and do it?
Yeah, I think it's hard because with the implications and the risks that we've just outlined, it's really hard to get past those problems to encourage a business to utilize it. And then the barrier for entry currently is quite high in terms of doing, rolling your own solutions and building your own models. You kind of need a significant level of data science background to actually get those kind of solutions off the ground without the help of a solution like ChatGPT. So I think the answer to that is that it remains to be seen in reality. I think the reality is, again, coming back to that sigmoid curve, we're probably very early, and I think it's exploded in virality very early. And we'll see, over time, those tools will explode in capability. And in a more general sense, those risks and ethical implications will be addressed by products that come out in future. So I guess give ourselves a pat on the back for being ahead of the curve and maybe having this discussion now, and I guess keeping an eye out for advances in the capability that help to address some of those implications.
Thanks, Ben. Definitely agree. Guys, we've come to the end, and I think the amount of comments and questions we've got here in our QA in the chat format actually just speaks to how big and important breakthrough this technology actually is. As I said before, in the details that we send out to the group, we'll actually address the questions that have been asked. We'll get Ben and Belinda to pick our best question, because let me tell you, there's plenty to opt from. Thank you all for coming along. I think it is clear to say, with the take-up Ben that you took us through at the very beginning of this session, we're going to continue to see exponential pace with not only this, but all of the questions that actually have been raised throughout the session today. Thank you, Ben and Belinda. Your expertise has been phenomenal. A really, really interesting topic, and I'm pretty sure we will have another one not too long about this as a topic itself. Really, really interesting, and great to see the different interactions and applications that people are really, challenging and grappling with within their organisations. Thanks, everybody, for your time. Look forward to seeing you all again soon, and watch out. We'll send all the details out. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fran.
Thanks, everyone.